Shalom, welcome to Jewish Christian Studies. In this year 2016, we are celebrating 51 years of a document that was given to us through Vatican Council II called Nostra Aetate. And this is telling us as Catholic Christians on how to understand our Jewish relationships and our Jewish roots that are found in Judaism. And in our Diocese of Youngstown, Ohio, we celebrated this over a many-year plan, Rabbi. Remember in 2010, we came for the 45th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, and we gave the community the Salvador Dali medallions of the 12 tribes of Israel. And they were graciously accepted by your community, and your community was well pleased with that. And then in 2014, we celebrated my 80th anniversary of baptism. We brought in Rabbi Bleck and tied it in with Nostra Aetate. And it was the artwork of Michelangelo that's in the Sistine Chapel. And, how did your community respond to that when he was exploring all that stuff about the Sistine Chapel? Huh?
They were amazed by it. And also, it was wonderful because it brought our communities together with a mutual spiritual understanding.
And then in 2015, which is going to be the 50th anniversary, we came back to the synagogue, and we had the people, the students from the religious ed studies at Holy Spirit Parish in Uniontown, Ohio, who compiled, in the sense, all the information they could find very succinctly of the 12 tribes of Israel, and that was presented to the community. And then Dr. Jeff Mickler, Father Mickler, in the sense, gave a tremendous presentation of talking about this document, Nostra Aetate, being a miracle in the life of the church to understand our Jewish roots. Then we moved from that. Then we went back to the villa now, where these lectures are taking place, and we had the artwork of Marc Chagall. Now, who was the speaker? Tamarkin was her last name.
Goodman Tamarkin. Susan Goodman Tamarkin.
And she presented, the idea that Chagall had an awful lot of crucifixion scenes in there, and basically showing that the Jewish community was the one being crucified. Then we saw Fiddler on the Roof. They had the guy playing the fiddle on the roof.
Yes, that's a classical picture.
Where the image, and that came from Chagall.
Life is like a fiddler, like as if we were a fiddler on the roof.
And then
very vulnerable.
Yes, and then we moved from visual arts to the sound arts and the idea of music. This is where we come to our presentation today, and it's from Dr. Grimes. And what do you have to say in the sense of his talking about those violins of hope? Violins that were used to provide music for those who were going to the gas chambers and to the ovens of...
Amazing stories, because we know that music provides people a window to the soul. And there are remarkable stories of how violins and their music save people's lives. But at the same time, I always look at identity, the way I was raised, as our spiritual identity, more important than our affiliations and so on. And when we look at the fact that places like Auschwitz actually had an orchestra while all that evil was going on, we're reminded that we human beings have a choice of succumbing to the worst that we're capable of, or being stimulated by this sacred identity that God created us with. And so these stories are very motivating.
Yeah, these violins were actually, in the sense, showed up in a repair shop in Tel Aviv, and we'll be speaking about that in the presentation of the guy that was refurbishing these. And basically, they even found ashes within those violins that were probably from the crematory. Yeah?
Yes, because as the orchestra was playing at Auschwitz, the ashes were falling onto the violins, and so in so many ways, what these violins represent is remarkable, and should remind us of what we need to do as God's children.
And as we're going to be having that presentation in a few seconds, from the villa in Pennsylvania, where the conference room, the Sisters of the Humility of Mary, in a sense, let me host this at their facility. And we brought in Dr. Grimes, who wrote the book on the Violins of Hope. And there's an awful lot of history there, and he's going to make the presentation. And what I find very interesting here is that we see a producer of television, and his name is going to be Lance Schultz. And we'll see a little bit of that at the end of the presentation. So let us now move to the villa in Villa Maria, Pennsylvania, in the conference room, and listen to Dr. Grimes.
And on behalf of the Sisters of the Humility of Mary, and this is our home, as well as VMESC, we certainly are very, very grateful to all of you for coming and sharing this very special evening with us. And before we begin, I would like to just take one moment to acknowledge Father Velasco, who's here up in the front row, who sponsors this presentation. This is our third annual Nostra Aetate lecture, and this was Father Velasco's idea and his dream, and he sponsors the entire event. So we are very grateful for this gift and for his willingness to support this that brings so many people together and where we are able to join in our diversity. And so as we begin our presentation, what I would ask is if you would just join me in an opening prayer. We praise you, God of the universe, for the beauty and the abundance of this summer season, and for calling us together and bringing us together for this very special event. We thank you for the gift of our presenter, Dr. Grimes, and we ask that he continue to be blessed and that we will be nourished by the message he brings us this evening. And as we gather this evening, we hold in a very special way in our hearts all those who are victims of violence and persecution. May they be comforted by the compassion and mercy of our God. And may we, in our witness to understanding, unity, and peace, fill our communities and have that flow out to the entire world and bring about a transformation of all. Amen.
Amen.
And now what I'd like to do is introduce Matt Abernowski, who is the program director for VMESC, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Sister. Just a couple of housekeeping items for the evening. Restrooms are out the room and to the left. There's a set right past the conference rooms and another set past the chapel and dining room. And after the lecture this evening, we hope you will join us in the dining room for some refreshments and a social hour. And after the lecture, which will be about 30 or 40 minutes, there'll be a period of question and answers. And what we would ask is this mic is a wireless, and we'll bring it around to you so that if you do want to ask a question, everybody can hear the question that's asked and Dr. Grimes' response to it. So just to keep that in mind if you want to ask a question. We've been very fortunate with this lecture series. The three speakers we have had, including Dr. Grimes, have been very gracious and eager to accept the invitation. And I was thinking about this morning when I was standing out with the summer camp kids pouring down sweat in the garden. I said, I bet Dr. Grimes is going to get off the plane in Pittsburgh and feel like he never left Charlotte because it's so hot and humid up here today. But we are very grateful to have him with us. You know from your program that he is a very gifted and accomplished musicologist, a writer, and a speaker. And what's not in the program, but we were sharing a conversation about, is he's also a proud father of two young children, Helen, who's 4, and William, who is 1, meaning with his responsibilities as chair of the music department in North Carolina, and with the young family, he's not able to go out and do these types of things as much. And so we are extremely grateful that he accepted this invitation and could be with us this evening. And please join me in extending a warm Villa Maria welcome to Dr. Jay Brown.
Thank you, Matt. Can we go on? Thank you, Matt, and thank you all for coming. I am very honored and very pleased to be here as part of this very important series and this very important work that this community does. As Matt mentioned, I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then I'll take some of your questions that you might have on this Violins of Hope project. But I'm going to go ahead and knock out what's usually the very first question I get, which the father actually asked me just over dinner tonight, which is, how does a young man who's not Jewish and who can't play a lick of violin come to write this book, Violins of Hope, which is about a collection of violins that were played by Jewish musicians during the Holocaust? And the answer to that question is that the university where I teach, where I'm now the chair of the Department of Music, the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, had the honor of bringing 18 of these Violins of Hope to our city in 2012. It was at that point the first time they'd made an appearance in the Western Hemisphere. And as several of you know, they were actually, their second appearance was just a year ago over in Cleveland, not too far from here, for a lengthy stay in the Maltz Museum of Heritage. I had the honor of curating the Museum of the Violins there and several community events. And it was a really big deal for us at UNC Charlotte to be the first and to sort of provide the model for other programs like the one in Cleveland. And at the time, I wasn't the chair of the Department of Music at the time. I was just a professor of musicology. And in the years leading up to that big Violins of Hope exhibit and series of performances, as they were building the community partnerships and raising the money and doing the programming, we kept hearing these stories. Okay, in 2012, we're bringing these violins, and here's what they are, and here's the story behind them. And I just became really inspired by this idea of people holding on to music and using it as a way to reassure themselves of their ongoing humanity, but in many cases using music as a method of staying alive in the absolute worst of times. So in 2011, I took a trip out to Israel, and I met with Amnon Weinstein, who's the Israeli violin maker who's been collecting and restoring these instruments over the past 20 years or so. And talking with him and learning his story and how he got involved in the project and seeing the violins for myself, I really became inspired by the whole project, and that's what inspired me to write this book, Violins of Hope. I spent about a week with Amnon in Israel and in Tel Aviv, and at first I really knew I wanted to write this book, but I couldn't figure out how, because each violin has a very unique and interesting story, but a collection of short stories don't always work together to make a great book. And it really wasn't until the very end of my stay that I realized that Amnon is the figure who brought this together and keeps this project going. And so it's actually Amnon who is the heart of the project and becomes the heart of my book. And so if you'd indulge me, I'd like to spend a few minutes tonight introducing you to Amnon and a little bit about his story, because I think it'll help put the project into a really interesting context. Amnon's earliest memories are of sitting around the family table at major Jewish holidays like Rosh Hashanah and Passover in the late 1940s. There were 4 people at the table: Amnon, his little sister Esther, and his parents, Moshe and Golda Weinstein. And there were 400 ghosts in the room. These were the ghosts of the relatives whom Moshe and Golda had left behind when they had immigrated in 1938 to Palestine, where Moshe worked first at one of the orange groves and then fulfilled his dream of opening up a violin repair shop in Tel Aviv. When they first moved to Palestine, they received letters from some of the relatives they'd left behind. These relatives were asking for their help with securing visas and the other necessary paperwork to immigrate to the British Mandate of Palestine at the time. But after Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, they'd heard nothing of their family, they'd heard nothing from their family. It wasn't until after the war, where a survivor came and visited Moshe in Tel Aviv, that they learned the awful truth, the unbelievable truth, which was that their entire family, 400 people in all, had been murdered during the Holocaust. The pain of this discovery was too much for Moshe to bear. He had a heart attack that night, the first in a series of cardiac events that ultimately killed him. He never spoke of his family again. It was too difficult for him physically and emotionally. Amnon's mother also struggled to find the words to talk about her family. She threw away the letters that she had received. Their voices were like memories she could no longer bear to hear. When young Amnon asked her, "Where are my grandparents? Where are my uncles, my aunts, my cousins?" she couldn't summon the words to explain to him why he would never be able to meet them. The best she could do was to take out a book she'd found about the Holocaust, and she would point to the ghastly photos of the dead. And she would tell the young boy, this is our family. This is what's happened to them. Although Moshe and Golda couldn't really articulate their grief, that sorrow, the unbelievable sorrow that they felt over their family, permeated the Weinstein household, and with it, Amnon's childhood. Moshe was the president of an immigrants association, and he would open up the Weinstein home for the few survivors from their hometown of Vilna, Lithuania, who had come to the land of their biblical ancestors in the hopes of starting a new life. Moshe welcomed them all for homemade meals and warm beds until they could find homes of their own. As still a very young boy, Amnon was frightened by these emaciated strangers. He couldn't figure out why they were startled by every noise. He couldn't figure out why they would hide leftover bread under their pillows at night. Years passed until he stopped hearing the sound of them crying themselves to sleep in his own nightmares. But Amnon, growing up, tried to forget about this unimaginable tragedy that had robbed him of his extended family and replaced them with these emaciated strangers. Instead, he busied himself by establishing a career as a luthier, a maker and repairer of string instruments, apprenticing first with his father at the workshop in Tel Aviv, and then traveling to the city of Cremona, Italy, the city that gave us the greatest violin dynasties of Guarneri, Stradivarius, and Amati, and then traveling to Paris to study with some of the greatest violin makers of the 20th century. When Moshe passed away in the mid-1980s, Amnon took over the family business. And even though he continued to try to ignore the Holocaust, it continued to haunt him. Just a few years after Moshe passed away, a survivor from Auschwitz came into the Weinstein workshop. He brought with him a violin he had played in the death camp, but which he hadn't touched since. He now wanted to get it repaired in the hopes that his grandson would learn to play the instrument. Amnon opened the case and immediately saw damage to the top of the violin from having been played outside in the rain and the snow of Auschwitz. When he opened up the instrument to make the extensive repairs it required, he discovered inside the violin ashes. Ashes that he could only assume were fallout from the crematoria at Auschwitz. The very thought of what this violin and its owner had been through together shook Amnon to his core. But he pushed these gruesome thoughts aside. At that point in his life, he was still not quite ready to confront the Holocaust. It wasn't until the late 1990s when Amnon started training his own son, Avshalom, how to make and repair violins, using the same tools in the same workshop that Amnon's father had taught him, that Amnon was finally able to reclaim his lost heritage. He started thinking about the role that music, specifically the violin, played in Jewish lives during the Holocaust. He started collecting and restoring these instruments that were played in concentration camps and ghettos, painstakingly piecing them back together so they can come alive again on the concert stage. And although several of the musicians who once played these neglected and damaged instruments were silenced by the Holocaust, their voices and spirits live on through the violins that Amnon has lovingly restored. He calls these instruments the violins of hope. I'd like to share with you a few of the stories that I'm honored to tell in the book Violins of Hope. And one of those stories has to do with a violin known as Ole Bull's violin. On January 16th of 1941, Ernst Glaser, the Jewish concertmaster of the Oslo Philharmonic Orchestra, was scheduled to give a concerto in the Nazi-occupied city of Bergen, Norway. And as a special treat to the Bergen audience, he decided to bring with him a valuable instrument. It's a Guarneri del Gesù violin, really the equivalent of a Stradivarius. That would be valuable in and of itself, being a Guarneri, but this instrument was especially valuable because it had once been owned and played by the beloved 19th century violin virtuoso Ole Bull, who was from Bergen. So this was a real treat for the Bergen audience to hear his violin being played by the country's greatest living violin player at that time. The concert began innocently enough with a performance of Haydn's Military Symphony. About halfway through the first movement, a large group of teenage boys came into the hall and started occupying the empty seats. Some of the elderly concert goers thought it was nice that these young people were finally starting to take an interest in classical music. Some things never quite change, but wondered why the boys couldn't come on time. But those who were close enough in the dark hall to see the boys were able to see their uniforms that they wore and were immediately aware of the more sinister truth that these boys were a member of Norway's national youth, the Norwegian version of the Hitler Youth. And unbeknownst to the audience, they had come to that concert specifically for the purpose of disrupting it, for the Jewish concertmaster's appearance. So the orchestra played all four movements of the Haydn Symphony, and then the conductor, Harold Heide, went backstage between the numbers, which is customary for a conductor to do, only he didn't come back out for a long time. And so there was a sort of long, uncomfortable pause during the concert where nothing was happening. Backstage, Heide was being told by Nazi officials that Ernst Glaser must not be allowed to perform on the stage. Heide found this unacceptable, but didn't quite know what to do about it. So he sort of postponed things to give himself some time to figure out how to handle the situation. He went back out to the audience and announced a program change. The orchestra would now play Paul Graner's orchestral suite, The Flute of Sanssouci, which came after the concerto on the program. He conducted all four movements of the suite, and then again, nothing happened. Heide could be seen pacing back and forth behind the orchestra looking distraught. The musicians looked at him and each other in confusion. Nobody knew what was happening or what was going to happen next. Finally, Heide resigned himself to the fact that he would simply be putting Glaser at too much of a risk if he allowed him to perform in these conditions. So he went back to the front of the stage and announced that he was very sorry, but that the rest of the concert would have to be canceled. "What the hell?" one of the National Youth cried from the balcony. "Why doesn't he come?" "Is it because Glaser is a Jew?" shouted another of the National Youth, and then all hell broke out. The National Youth, they stood up, they started shouting, "Down with the Jews, down with the Jews." Someone turned the lights of the hall on, and so finally everybody could see these young boys in their National Youth uniforms. The boys who were in the balcony started throwing down these flyers that say, in actually quite misspelled Norwegian, they declared Ole Bull's violin to be a national treasure. And they're protesting the fact that this dirty Jew was traveling with this national treasure, making money off of it. And they demanded an end to Ernst Glaser's performance career then and there in Bergen. In what I believe to be one of the most heroic moments in all of classical music, the audience came to Glaser's defense. Fistfights broke out in the audience. There's a letter from an elderly woman who talks about striking one of the hooligans over the head with the handle of her umbrella. A member of the violin section of the orchestra stood up and tore off his tuxedo jacket and jumped into the crowd to join the bloody fistfight in defense of Glaser. Before the riot could get too far out of control, the conductor, Harold Heide, leapt back up to the podium and instructed the orchestra, "Play the national anthem, damn it!" The orchestra rose and played the opening chords of Norway's national anthem. Now in Norway, as is true here in the United States, when one hears the national anthem, one is compelled to stop whatever you're doing, stand at attention, and sing along. And of course, Harold Heide knew that. So while the audience members were saying they're singing, also the members of the National Youth in their twisted version of patriotism were also standing, extending their right arms, standing there frozen, extending their right arms in the notorious Nazi salute. And while they were standing there like statues, Harold Heide made sure that Ernst Glaser and Ole Bull's violin were whisked safely out the backstage door. There are many heroic stories in Violins of Hope, but one of the most heroic tales is that of a 13-year-old boy named Mottola Schlein. Now, Mottola was out playing one day when the Nazis came and were to murder his parents and his sister. And he was returning home and actually heard the gunshots. He saw the Nazis entering the home and hid. And from his hiding place, he heard the gunshots. And after they left, he walked into their home and discovered the bodies there and the blood on the floor. And he escaped into the forest. And at the very last second, thinking to bring with him his cherished instrument, his violin. And he lived for a while in the forest, just trying to stay alive, until ultimately he met up with and joined the legendary partisan brigade known as Uncle Misha's Jewish group. And as a partisan, guerrilla, a freedom fighter, Mottola quickly established himself as a very clever and daring young man with actually quite a knack for espionage. In August of 1943, Uncle Misha was planning an attack on the city in Ukraine. Overk was the name of the town. And before he took his partisans into Overk, he needed to know where the sympathies of the townspeople were. If they walked into the city, would they be welcomed as liberators? Or would they be oppressed? Would they be seen as aggressors? Were the townspeople sympathetic with the Nazis, or would they be sympathetic with the Russians and the partisans? So to discover this, he sent out a few of the partisans as spies. Their job was go into the city and just sort of walk around and take the temperature and try to start some conversations and see what happens. But he also dispatched young Mottola. Mottola's job was to bring his violin, and he would stand in front of the local church with a group of beggars who always stood there singing and things and begging for alms. And while he was playing his violin, though, he'd be able to keep a lookout on the other partisans as they walked through the town. And if there were any trouble, it'd be a very easy matter for Mottola to shut his violin case and get back to Uncle Misha and report of the troubles. But Mottola was no ordinary street performer. A very, very talented young boy. And quickly he attracted a crowd around him as he played. Suddenly there was a commotion at the back of the crowd. It was a Nazi officer, and he sort of pushed the people aside until he was standing in front of young Mottola. Mottola was so engrossed with his violin playing, he had his eyes closed and he's deep into the music. He didn't even notice the German officer until the German officer tapped him on the shoulder with his riding crop. And looking up, Mottola instantly saw the uniform, stood up, and gave a reverential bow. "Come with me," ordered the Nazi commander. Mottola didn't know what he wanted or what was going on, but he knew he had to keep his cover as long as he could. To do otherwise would put not only his life in danger, but also the lives of his fellow partisans in the town. So he followed the Nazi commander down through the streets, down a couple blocks, until they came to an officers' club. This officer club was one of many restaurants that the Nazis had commandeered between Germany and the Eastern Front. It was a place where officers on their way to the Eastern Front could fortify their spirits with French wine and gourmet food, great music, and pretty Ukrainian waitresses who served them in more ways than one. And the Nazi officer, assuming that Mottola was not a young Jewish boy, but an ethnic Ukrainian, offered Mottola a job playing the violin at this officers' club. Again, to protect his cover, Mottola had no real choice but to just keep playing along. So yes, okay, I'll do it. Okay, so you get 2 Reichmarks a day plus free lunch and free dinner. Okay, sounds great. So he went back to the partisans and reported what was happening, and Uncle Misha immediately saw the advantages of having an asset in the officers' club. So Mottola would play every day for the lunch shift and for the dinner shift, and these Nazi officers somewhat adopted this young boy, who again they assumed was an ethnic Ukrainian. And the local commandant went so far as to have a little German uniform and cap tailored for the 13-year-old boy. So here's this 13-year-old boy who was footsteps from his family home when Nazis came and murdered his father, his mother, and his beloved little sister. And every day he puts on his German uniform and cap, and he goes, he eats his lunch, and then he takes out his violin, and he entertains these Nazi soldiers. He smiles for them, he befriends them, he takes their requests and learns all their favorite songs. But the entire time, he's also eavesdropping on their conversations. And he's taking note of the types of uniforms that are being worn on their way to the Eastern Front. He reports everything back to the partisans, who are, of course, by this time, in contact with the Red Army. Mottola becomes a viable asset in the intelligence mission against Nazi Germany. One day, after Mottola took his lunch in the basement kitchen, he was about to go back upstairs to the main hall, when he looked down the hallway and he saw a door that had been left slightly open. Now, being a curious 13-year-old boy, he walked down the hallway and sort of stuck his head in and saw a storeroom that had been pretty much abandoned. Empty wine cases, forgotten herring barrels, just stuff probably before the occupation that had been completely forgotten about. But along the wall on the other side of the door, he saw a jagged crack along the wall in the foundation of the building. And Mottola immediately hatched a plot to fill that crack with explosives, blow them up and destroy the building and kill all the Germans inside. So every day Mottola put on his little German uniform, he'd take out the violin, he'd play, he'd smile, he'd laugh at the jokes, he'd take the requests, and that night he'd go back downstairs to the basement, he'd have his free dinner, and then when no one was looking, he'd sneak into that storeroom. He'd take the violin out of the case, hide the violin in an empty barrel, and walk away with an empty violin case. When he returned the next morning, he'd have that same violin case, only now he'd have a few pounds of explosives hidden inside. He'd sneak back into the storeroom, swap out the explosives for the violin, and then go about his day. When he brought in enough explosives, then he'd sneak in and tear away the loose rocks along that crack, trying to make the crack bigger so he could pack as many explosives in there as possible. And then when it was all set, he set the detonator. He didn't turn it on. He left it there, and then hid it behind some trash, and walked away. All that was left was wind. And during that time, Mottola would also go down to the river that borders over it and pretend to be swimming or fishing while secretly looking for a path that was just shallow enough for him to make his escape so he could get out of town quickly after he blew up this building. The perfect opportunity to do that finally presented itself one day when a large group of high-ranking SS officers were coming through Overk on their way to try to salvage the increasingly perilous situation on the Eastern Front. It would have been much better for them to have gone by train, but the partisans had disrupted the railroads, blowing up bridges and railways, so now they had no choice but to go by car, and that took them straight through Overk and right into Mottola's trap. So they started arriving in the late afternoon, immediately started drinking and smoking and carrying on, and Mottola did his usual daily thing of playing for them. It was so full they didn't let him take any breaks, so by the end of the day he'd been playing for hours and hours on end without any breaks, and his fingers ached from playing so much. His eyes were stinging from all the cigar smoke, but he finally kept playing until they allowed him to stop for the evening. He went back downstairs to the basement and told the cook he was just so tired from playing all day. He wasn't even hungry, he was just so tired. He just wanted to go home and go to sleep. But instead, he snuck down that dimly lit corridor. He felt around till he found the door, opened it, and quietly closed it behind him. Using just a few rays of light from a grated window, he located the detonator that he'd left there, and he ignited it. Then he ran back out the hallway, up the stairs, and slowed only long enough to walk through the door where the soldier was standing guard, and looked at the soldier, threw out his right arm, and proclaimed a sarcastic Heil Hitler on his way out. The soldier on guard, familiar with the affable young man in his little German uniform, just said, "Ah, you little Ukrainian swine," and Mottola vanished into the darkness. He ran for several yards before he heard the explosion behind him. He felt the ground shake. He looked over his shoulder and saw a red ball of fire extending into the sky. But he didn't have time to celebrate. He had to get out of town. So he worked his way along the path he'd found, pressing his body up against the buildings to avoid being seen, then plunged into the lake. Along that route he'd identified as being just shallow enough where if he held his violin in its case above his head, he could protect it from the cold water that reached all the way up to his neck. When he reached the other side of the river, a group of Uncle Misha's partisans were there to pluck him out of the water and put him back in the back of a horse-drawn carriage, and then they disappeared back into the safety of the dense forests. For the first several moments, Mottola was speechless, stunned by the overwhelming success of his mission. And then, raising a clenched fist to the red sky, he proclaimed, "That is for my parents and my little sister." When I talk about music during the Holocaust, a lot of people are surprised to find that there were orchestras in Auschwitz. In fact, there were orchestras in a number of camps, including Auschwitz and its various subcamps that together we collectively refer to as Auschwitz. These were ensembles comprised of prisoners of the death camp, who, as part of their forced labor, were compelled to perform music. And sometimes they performed out at the train stop. So as train loads of Jews came rolling in, they'd emerge from these cattle cars that they'd been packed in and suffocated for days, and they'd see a beautifully manicured lawn, and they'd hear an orchestra playing. And so how bad could this place be? Music was part of that deception, as it was at other camps. Sometimes they'd play concerts on Sundays for their Jewish guards. It made the camp administration feel like noble, the members of the nobility. They had their estate, if you would, and they were so noble that the estate had its own orchestra, just like the great estates of Austria and Germany of the 18th and 19th century. But the orchestra's primary function in Auschwitz and elsewhere was to play every day at the camp gates. So the orchestra would get their instruments and they'd set up every morning at the camp gates, and they would play these schmaltzy German marches as their fellow prisoners would march out of the camp on their way to horribly difficult work details in their regular rows of 5 that allowed the Germans to easily count how many had walked out that morning. And the orchestras were there to promote marching discipline, to help everybody stay in step so they could leave the camp in orderly fashion. The musicians would play until the last of the parade had gone through. Then they would pack up their instruments, and they too would go out to work detail. But they would be the last ones out and the first ones back in, because they'd have to set the orchestra back up at the end of the day as their fellow prisoners came dragging their exhausted bodies back into camp, again to play these schmaltzy German marches while the marchers marched in the rows of 5 in step, and so the Nazi officers could count how many had not made it back that day. So in return for their service to the orchestra, the musicians received less work detail. They were the last ones out, the first ones back. Sometimes they were able to stay behind and repair instruments or arrange music. The camp administration was surprisingly aware of what the orchestra was playing and was constantly asking for new music, and that required some to stay behind and write out these tunes, then create the orchestrations for the ensembles to play. Others would be assigned work in the kitchen. So in the winter in Poland, not only are you not outside, but you also have the advantage to sneak a couple extra bites of food. So while membership in the orchestra was by no means a guarantee of survival, many members of the orchestra perished in the concentration camp, but they did perish in lesser numbers than the general population. The few advantages they received, for some of them, certainly not all, gave them just enough to survive one more day, and then one more day, and then one more day, until ultimately, through playing music, they were able to outlive the Nazi regime. Now, the orchestras themselves have a bit of a tortured legacy. It's very difficult to really assess, what role these people played in the orchestra. Their memoirs and the testimonies of survivors are mixed in what they see of people doing what they needed to do to stay alive, or people who could be seen as contributing to the camp machinery. And so Primo Levi, for example, in Survivor of Auschwitz, he writes about being in the infirmary in Auschwitz III, what should have been a death sentence, being sent to the infirmary, and he survived at least long enough to leave us his wonderful writings. But he writes about lying in the infirmary and hearing the orchestra just, as the wind would change, sometimes he'd hear the bass drum and the cymbals, and then the wind would change again and he'd hear nothing. And what he'd hear was the same schmaltzy German tunes over and over and over again. And he wrote, "We all feel this music is infernal. What an insult to humanity that in a place like this we'd have music." But other survivors were kinder. They talk about returning back in the late evening from their work detail, and hearing that orchestra gave them that pep in the step they needed, because to appear weak, to appear ill, would be to appear useless to the camp, and to appear useless in the camp was to be sent immediately to the gas chamber. So they're having their fellow musicians there urging them on to appear strong gave them that source of strength. Even a number of the musicians really struggled. Those who survived struggled with what they had done. And many of them, some of them went on to have very fine music careers, but many of them never touched their instruments again. There's a tactile memory of when you hold that instrument to you, remembering what you and the instrument had been through together and never wanting to experience those memories again. In addition to survivor's guilt, in addition to the feeling that they had corrupted their art. Yes, to stay alive, but nevertheless, they had, in some sense, sold themselves. In my book, Violins of Hope, I'm privileged to write about 6 violins and tell the stories of how the musicians who played them were able to stay alive using their music. But the majority of violins in this Violins of Hope collection that Amnon Weinstein has put together came to him with no information about their provenance. In these cases, the instruments themselves can sometimes tell us a story. We can tell by the craftsmanship and the construction that they were made in Eastern Europe around the turn of the 20th century, very typical of the types of instruments that Jewish musicians would be playing at the time. Some of them have that distinctive damage to the top that comes from being played outside in the rain and the snow, something that no musician would ever do unless compelled to do so under extraordinary conditions. And a number of them, like the one we saw Shlomo Mintz playing, have Stars of David ingrained into the wood. So from the totality of the evidence, we can surmise that these were violins that were played by Jewish musicians in concentration camps and ghettos. These are typically not intrinsically expensive instruments. They're not Stradivariuses or like the Guarneri del Gesù that Ernst Glauser tried unsuccessfully to bring to Bergen. They are simple, unsophisticated instruments that represent simple, ordinary, everyday Jewish lives and everyday Jewish traditions that were almost destroyed by the Nazis. To Amnon, these are actually the most precious instruments in his collection. Their sentimental and historical value far outweighs any monetary worth. Amnon will never know the names of his 400 relatives, his uncles, his aunts, and his cousins. They were buried in mass graves, so there are no graveyards he can visit to look at tombstones to try to piece together his genealogy. There are no surviving relatives nor family records where he could go to learn the stories about his family that his parents had been too grief-stricken to tell him. The only method Amnon has of connecting with his lost family is through the craft his father taught him, repairing violins. And so Amnon continues to collect and restore violins that were played by Jewish musicians during the Holocaust. Each violin tells its own story. Each violin is a tombstone for a relative Amnon never knew. Thank you.
They played their violins in the filthy ghettos and squalid work camps of Nazi Germany. They played as their families, friends, neighbors, and strangers walked to their deaths. They played for their lives and to keep hope alive.
You're right by the gate, a huge gate with the name on top. In German, Arbeit macht frei, meaning work will make you free. As we entered, a symphonic orchestra was playing Beethoven. It was an unbelievable sight. People were being killed and beaten, and there's an orchestra playing.
The musicians who played are long gone, most perishing in the brutal Holocaust. But miraculously, some of their instruments survived. Scarred, beaten by weather, and sometimes in pieces, a few of these long-forgotten violins were restored to life by a remarkable master violin maker in Tel Aviv, Israel. His name is Amnon Weinstein.
When I'm getting all these instruments, they are in very, very poor condition. Some, they suffered a lot in the Holocaust. Some suffered a lot because people were putting them in the attic. They didn't want to see the violin anymore.
Though their owners' voices were silenced by hatred and cruelty, Amnon vowed these violins would one day speak for them. In 2015, the violins did speak, triumphantly. Played by student musicians and a world-renowned violin virtuoso inside a classroom, and from the stage of a beautifully restored synagogue turned concert hall in Cleveland, Ohio.
Each violin like that you are going to play, it is for millions of people that are dead. The sound that you heard today, that is victory. And each concert is a victory.
Today, these extraordinary instruments have earned the name Violins of Hope.
You've just experienced the hard copy presentation of Dr. Grimes' presentation of Violins of Hope. And you also saw a little bit of a video that was produced by Lance Schultz for public PBS for WVIZ in Cleveland. And what we saw there in a sense is that the hard copy becoming a video presentation. What I found interesting is that I was aware of this video on the 9th of August, that Tuesday before our lecture at the Villa in Pennsylvania, when we were remembering Edith Stein, who was known as Sister Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, a Jewish woman who was actually executed because she was Jewish, not because she was a Christian. And with that, in the sense, I was very much aware of that on her way to the execution chamber, to the gas chamber, she probably heard the music played by these violins. And so, Rabbi, I was just touched by that, and I just share that with you in the sense, and then what work that Lance Schultz has done, and you'll be able to see that video through the idea of the internet information that is given on the screen.
I wanted to mention a book that follows up with one of the violins, the Huberman violin. The book is The Orchestra of Exiles by Josh Aronson and Denise George. And it's a very inspirational book with Huberman, the greatest violinist in the world, who also saved many people. And eventually these exiles became the symphony for the country of Israel.
Yeah. And as we, want to thank the sisters of the Villa in Villa Maria, Pennsylvania, the Amelia Mary sisters, for hosting these lectures on the anniversary of Nostra Aetate. We will be gathering someone this year in 2017, and the subject matter may be talking about Yad Vashem and virtual reality for those who are aware of that Holocaust memorial in the city of Jerusalem. And also, we've got just 1 minute left, Rabbi. The comment of in Poland, in the sense you might be aware of this, that they're concerned about referring to the Polish situation of being the Holocaust, where the Holocaust took place. Are you aware of that?
Oh, I don't know which particular
But
situation you're referring
it's interesting in the sense of sort of like a denial, even in our day and age. So with that, we have to bring to a close this segment, and be aware of what's coming up. We have more programs on Nostra Aetate as years go by. And so till next time, shalom.
Spotlight is a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. It seeks to spotlight people, places, and events from around the Diocese of Youngstown that promote the new gospel of joy called for by Pope Francis. Your program host is Father James Corda.
Hello and welcome to Spotlight. I'm Father Jim Corda. Today we're going to talk with the Jewish community, and we're also going to discuss Jewish-Catholic dialogue. And joining me in today's discussion is Rabbi Frank Muller and Father George Blasco. Welcome to our show, both of you.
Thank you.
Shalom.
We also know that Road of Shalom is celebrating a significant anniversary this year, and so we will talk a little bit more about your congregation and its anniversary a little later on in the show. Before we get into our discussion, it might be good, Rabbi, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself, and so the folks that are with us could get to know you a little bit better.
Oh, thank you. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, and actually was a business major in college at Berkeley, and had change of heart through all my involvements in the Jewish community. Growing up, I was a camp counselor and a youth group leader and a Sunday school teacher. And at some point, I just decided, I'm really doing a lot of things in the Jewish community. Maybe this is something I want to do as a profession. And I made the switch I graduated from Berkeley with a business degree, but then I entered Hebrew Union College in the rabbinical school and became a rabbi. I have served congregations in St. Louis and Roanoke, Virginia, and I've been in Youngstown now for 20 years.
Well, we're very happy to have you in Youngstown. I'm sure you miss the West Coast, but we're glad to have you
Not
here.
really.
All right.
It's a little too hectic out there.
Oh, I would imagine.
I like the Midwest a lot.
Well, tell us exactly about the role of the rabbi in the Jewish community. Is it considered a spiritual leadership role? How is that in relationship to something like a pastor or a priest in a parish?
Well, actually, the role of the rabbi has changed significantly over the last half century. And I'm sure Father Belasco can remember the days of Rabbi Berkowitz, who worked very closely with Bishop Malone. And in those days, the primary role of the rabbi was to be the emissary to the non-Jewish community. And so Rabbi Berkowitz was in a lot of civic organizations, and he was a public figure. And he and Bishop Malone did many joint ventures together. Mm-hmm. The congregation really was secondary, because the rabbi was the Jewish community's ambassador, if you will, to the rest of the community. That was very important to the membership. That has changed radically now, where we're encountering a lot more fragmented Jewish identity on the part of modern American Jews. And so rabbis have really changed their focus from being out in the community to staying in the synagogue, what we call inreach rather than outreach, to keep our members connected and involved with their Jewish lives. So that's really what I do. In addition, of course, to all the religious and pastoral and life cycle functions, is I am working to create programs that keep today's Jews connected to the synagogue.
And I'd like to bring Father Blasco into the conversation. Your long experience with dialogue with the Jewish community as a Catholic priest, as a Christian, how have you seen that evolve, and how have you seen your role as a Catholic Christian leader evolve?
Well, 2 years before I was ordained, a document out of Vatican Council II called Nostra Aetate, in our times, talked about our relations with the Jewish background of Christianity. Remember that Jesus is Jewish, and he wasn't Croatian, he wasn't Italian, and so basically in the sense, and under Father Maley, who taught us scripture in the seminary at St. Mary's and down in Norwood, Ohio, Cincinnati Diocese, basically I was open to that. And coming back and being ordained in 1967, The Vatican document Nostra Aetate came out in 1965, so I already had that background. And under the, how would say, the tutelage and the example of Bishop Malone, he was very close with Rabbi Berkowitz, as you said, and basically we were already implementing that. And also the cantor of Ehrlich, who was the cantor over at...
Cantor Ehrlich.
Yeah, and basically he liked the singing of Cantor Ehrlich and assessed any music from the Fiddler on the Roof.
Right, he was famous for being Tevye.
And so basically, and so I just fit right into it in the sense of understanding our roots of Christianity and Judaism. And there's more and more coming out every day. A.J. Levine, you just met her a couple weeks ago or so. They're down in, where, North Carolina?
In Naples.
Naples,
Florida.
in Florida,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And basically, that insight and the parables of Jesus and all that, and we've had her on 2 occasions in memory of Rabbi Meyer, and the lecture series that we've had going on now for 20-some years. So basically, it's just something, it's my golf game. I need it in the sense to understand myself and Judaism as the roots of Christianity.
Mm-hmm. And that's really important for us as Christians to understand our roots and to understand the wealth that we have gotten through the Jewish community. You know, when we talk about ecumenism or interfaith dialogue, it's always important to look at those things that unite us and those things that we can build on as people of faith. What would you see, Rabbi, as some of those things that we have in common that we can celebrate, that we really need to build on, not in a spiritual sense, but in a communal, social sense?
Well, you know, I'm glad you asked that question because, you know, for so long, the relationship between Jews and Christians was one of mistrust and distrust, and the very name of Jesus, you know, inflicted fear in the hearts of many Jews because of so much persecution through the centuries. And really, in the last 50 years since Nostra Aetate, there has been a significant endeavor to come together. To not that we should pave over our differences, but rather celebrate. We should celebrate our commonalities, and then really just respect the differences. You know, it used to the operative word used to be toleration. You know, that we'll tolerate each other. I don't like that word. It's not a good word, and I don't want to be tolerated, but I want to be respected for my beliefs, and I think that's what dialogue is trying to do today. Is let's see where we're in common and celebrate those similarities, but also recognize that the things that we do differ. That's okay. We can be comfortable with each other. We can accept each other for those differences, and still have a good relationship. So that I think is where the new interfaith dialogue has occurred, rather than trying to say, well, we're all exactly the same. We're not. We have differences, but that's okay. You can still, you know, admire someone and have a relationship with them, even though you don't agree on everything.
Sure. We're going to talk more about that, but we're going to take a quick break. So please stay with us. We'll be right back.
Whether it's passing on medicine, a blanket, or something as simple as a glass of water, that's how compassion works. And that's how Maryknoll works, hand to hand to hand. For nearly 100 years, Maryknoll's been passing on your help to the priests and brothers working in 26 countries around the world. Maryknoll, an American Catholic organization, dedicates 86 cents of every dollar donated to their programs, serving the world's poor and powerless. And that's how it works. Compassion flows from your hand to the hand of someone in need. Hand to hand to hand. That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's
Maryknoll. That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll. That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.